overall profitability potential. And in the last video, Travis introduced PESTEL framework and the famous Porter's five forces model, which can help us analyze the impact of external environments on firms' performance. And in this short video, I'd like to add some more details and important tips for using the Porter's five forces model, because you are going to use this model throughout the semester. But not only that, you will probably use this model throughout your career. Also, in this video, I will introduce the last component of the external analysis, which is strategic growth. So let's start. So first, on the five forces model, you may now know what the five forces are that influence the performance of a firm. So that is the threat of entry, threat of substitutes, and the threat of suppliers and buyers, and also the intra-industry rivalry or intra-industry competition. And the vertical part of this model, like a threat of entry, substitute, and existing competitors, are about current and potential competition a firm may face. The horizontal part of this model present forces or threats that arise from managing a firm's value chain, like power of suppliers and buyers, and also the competitors again. And bullet points here are some of the factors, individual factors, that may or may not influence the degree of each threat or each force. And you need to understand how each of these factors can impact the degree of forces and thus the profitability of a firm. So for example, let's take a look at the intra-industry rivalry here, the current competition in the market. And the degree of the competition will vary depending on competitive industry structure, industry growth, strategic commitments, and exit barriers. So for example, let's take the competitive industry structure, for example. If you recall your memory from taking Economics 101 class when you were a freshman probably, there are generally four different economic markets: perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly market, and monopoly market. So in a perfect competition market, there are so many numerous small firms that are not really differentiated from one another. So individual firms have minimal power. They don't really have power in the market, and they really can't set the price of their offerings. They are more price takers. On the other hand, in the monopoly market, there is only one firm. So because there is only one firm, that firm has a lot of power. This firm can set the price and set the quantity of the products they want to sell to consumers. So if you are an executive of a firm, which market would you like to be located in? In a perfect competition market or in the monopoly market? Definitely monopoly market, because you will be the only one player in the market, so you can just control the market, and you will enjoy this autonomy. And the huge, enormous power you will enjoy as the only player in the market will help the company build a huge high entry barriers, which can protect your company, from the threat of potential entrants. So it's good for you as an incumbent firm, as the only player in the market. And yeah, that's the monopoly market. So in this sense, you can analyze this information about the competitive structure the industry your company is in, and determine how this influences the overall profitability potential for your company. Does it make sense? And there are a couple more important points you need to consider when you use this five forces model. First of all, you always need to understand and think from what perspective you are analyzing the industry structure. From incumbent existing players' perspective, or potential entrance perspective, supplier or buyer. In the previous example of the monopoly market, the incumbent firm in the monopoly market enjoys this monopoly and has a lot of power. But on the other hand, the flip side of this is that the potential entrant does not have a lot of power. So this high entry barriers are good for the incumbent, but it's bad for the potential entrants. Same logic applies to the power of suppliers and buyers. If your supplier has a lot of power, it may not be a good thing for you to deal with them. Or if the supplier has the weaker power compared to me, my firm, and then maybe you are at a better, you can take advantage of this power dynamics. So always make sure from what perspective you are analyzing the industry structure. Also, you will need to think about the definition of industry or market. Is your definition of industry broader or more narrower? Or is your definition of industry applying only to a small specific geographic region or not? Depending on how you define this definition of industry or market, your analysis can look quite different. So always make sure to think about the definition of industry first. And the relative impacts of each force. In some industries, power of suppliers may matter more than power of buyers. Or the threat of substitutes may not matter more for some industries compared to the threat of entries or intra-industry rivalry. So you always need to think about the relative impacts of each force when determining the overall attractiveness of a market or industry. And the subjectivity analysis. Even based on the same set of information, managers lead to have different opinions about the attractiveness of an industry. So you as a manager, a future manager, what you need to do is try to think of as many factors, individual factors as possible that can influence the general profitability of the industry. And that way you may lead to more accurate analysis of the industry. finally, you always need to think about how this industry structure and dynamics change, because nothing is really static. So if you conduct this industry analysis using the Porter's five forces like a year ago, you may want to do it again this year, okay, so that you can reflect some changes in the industry properly to determine the overall attractiveness of the industry. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's take some quizzes here. Costs to change the. So the first one, the relative bargaining power of suppliers is low when incumbent firms face low switching costs to change suppliers. So when incumbent firms, existing firms face low switching costs, that means what? They can easily change their suppliers. So is it good or bad for incumbent firms? It's good for the incumbent firms, right? So the bargaining power of incumbent firms will be high. That means the relative bargaining power of suppliers will be low. Correct. So this statement is true. So not always, but most of the times, the power dynamics is always relative. So if it's good for incumbent firms, and there is a high chance that the relative bargaining power of suppliers is low. So the answer is true. What about the second question? The industry's attractiveness for incumbents is high when barriers to entry are low. So when barriers to entry are low, that means that it is easy for potential entrants to enter the market, which is bad for the incumbent firms, existing firms in the market. So the industry's attractiveness for incumbents will be low, correct? So the answer is false. All right, so that was the summary of the five forces model, something to consider when you use this five forces model to determine the overall attractiveness of the industry. And the last component of external analysis is strategic groups. So we started with the broad macro external environments that can influence the overall profitability of an industry in general. And then we used the PESTEL framework to analyze this macro environments. And then there was an industry analysis using the Porter's five forces model. And then before we move inside the firm, there is strategic groups here. Strategic groups are a set of companies within the same industry who have similar attributes, similar strategic focuses with similar resources and capabilities. So for example, in the airline industry, we can think of two different strategic groups. So one is like right here, like a low-cost carrier, like Southwest Airlines, JetBlue, Virgin Atlantic, Alaska Airlines. So usually they focus on domestic routes, and they usually use point-to-point system. Whereas companies like Delta, United, and American, they are full-service carriers. They have both domestic and international routes. They usually focus on hub-and-spoke systems compared to the low-cost carriers. So the mobility barrier here separates one strategic group from another within the same industry. Mobility barrier refers to a barrier to movement from one strategic group of firms within an industry to another group. So you need to differentiate the concept of mobility barrier and entry barrier. So mobility barrier is about the relationship within the incumbent firms within the same industry. So the companies within different strategic groups, and mobility barriers really separates one group from another. Whereas entry barriers is a concept for incumbent firms in general, overall, compared to potential entrants. So some potential players outside the industry. So you always need to think about the difference between mobility barrier and entry barrier here. And since companies within the same strategic groups share more attributes and they have more similar strategic focus from companies in another strategic group within the same industry, of course, the competition will be strongest between firms in the same strategic groups. Also, since companies within the same strategic group share more similar features and attributes and strategies, the external environment's influence on these firms will vary depending on what strategic groups they are in. So when you analyze the external environment's force or influence on a firm's potential profitability, you always need to understand what strategic group within the same industry your company is located in, because the implication of external factors may differ depending on the strategic group. Okay, so this is the end of the external analysis. So basically, you will need to think about broader macro environments and industry forces, and also the strategic group factors that may influence the overall attractiveness of the industry. Okay, thank you for watching.